the abuses from the executive office in our government now, executive actions which are hard to justify, claims of near pontifical powers by presidents. It's been going on, though, for a lot longer than just this one. How long, how severe, and what are some of the most amazing examples of this? Plus, let's talk about the continuity of government articles and how that could affect all of us coming up in just a moment. Well, Brian Tuohy, it's always a pleasure. Many people might remember Brian from his book, The Fix is In, and I know you always keep one eye peeled on professional sports and officiating and some of the subplots that we will hear about in sports radio and television. So before we get to disaster government, Brian, let me ask you about The Fix is In first. Any good stories you've been following lately?
Take your pick, Ian. Which one would you like? Sports is always filled with corruption.
Okay, come on. Give it to me. What do you think is another 4-star example of the fix of professional sports?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones you can point to, obviously, is the soccer match fixing scandal that kind of erupted recently, and that actually got coverage here in the United States, which is rare. And that, for people who don't know, Europol and FIFA basically said that 680 soccer matches around the world had been fixed, basically by organized crime and gamblers. And I think the key thing to take from all of that, and the thing that should matter to the people in the United States is of those 680 matches, the reason we know there's that many that have been fixed is because of legalized sports gambling. And that's the key thing, is because of legalized sports gambling, people who are betting on these fixed matches have to do it through legal sports books, and these legal sports books see strange betting patterns. They see the unnatural money that shows up on certain games. They report that to authorities. The authorities follow the money, and that's how they've been able to out these instances of game fixing in soccer. But here in the United States, because it's illegal, the only place it's legal really to bet on sports is in Nevada for the most part, nothing gets found out. So games that are being fixed today actively by organized crime and gamblers, and there are games being fixed today, because I know I've talked to people in Major League Baseball even recently about potential fixed games, that it doesn't get uncovered here because no one's looking for it.
You know, I thought I remembered when that I follow soccer a little bit. I watch a certain amount of Premier League, and I'm a fan of the team, the London team, Arsenal. And I was, but I thought part of it was the whole thing was Asian corruption, wasn't it? Wasn't that the story at the time? Was it Asian ringleaders that were behind the so-called match fixing?
Well, that's one of the things they've really pinpointed, is that a lot of it comes from Asian organized crime, because gambling is so intense in the Orient. But the interesting part of it is, and this researcher, this man by the name of Declan Hill, who wrote this great book about match fixing in soccer called The Fix, he pointed out that they know the main culprit probably behind this is a man by the name of Dan Tan. And the Singaporean authorities will not arrest this guy. Instead, supposedly, he's working with the authorities to out other match fixers. But that's like, bringing in Al Capone, not arresting Al Capone, but having Al Capone point out other people who are breaking the law.
Well,
so,
and except Al Capone would, like I'm assuming this guy would too, is essentially eliminating the competition.
Very real, or he's giving them the low fruit, the low-hanging fruit.
Right. But, I mean, he could be making his, 5 years from now, that could be a real investment if you knock out the people at the top in your rival organizations, Well,
exactly. And that's the scary part, is that they're trusting this guy as opposed to arresting him because they have plenty of evidence against him. They know that he's most likely fixed matches like in Italy and other countries in Europe. And these aren't small matches. I mean, we're talking like Serie A soccer in Italy is like their NFL. And this guy's supposedly fixed matches in that league.
Brian, let me ask you about the baseball player with whom you spoke recently, obviously without giving us any details.
It was actually Major League Baseball, not a baseball player.
But somebody within Major League Baseball.
Correct.
Who was telling you what?
Well, I interviewed, in researching for this next book that I have coming out on game fixing called Larceny Games, I interviewed the former head of NFL security, Warren Welsh, and recently I talked to His name's Dan Mullen. He's the head of the Department of Investigations for Major League Baseball. And I haven't gotten to completely interview him like I would like to, but I do know that the Department of Investigations, which is only about a staff of 5 or 6 people for Major League Baseball, which means about one investigator for every 4 teams out there, that they have recently investigated, potential instances of game fixing in Major League Baseball. And that's happened in the NFL, and it's happened in other sports as well. They just don't reveal this stuff.
Does that explain why the Cubs suck?
No, the Cubs have a different problem. I mean, they have a totally different problem, and that's partially their fans, and it's partially Wrigley Field, because everybody shows up to go to Wrigley for the party, and they don't care what happens on the field.
I worked for Tribune for a little while, and I was told that, I don't know did I ever tell you this, what they told me at Tribune? Did I ever tell you this?
You may have, I'm not sure.
Okay. That it didn't matter whether it was a winning streak or a losing streak, as long as it was a streak, that that the fans will show up to Wrigley Field whether they're winning or losing anyway, just to go to Wrigley Field and drink beer, and that but when it comes to like the revenue from radio and that the ratings would go up if the Cubs were losing 39 in a row or winning 39 in a row. And one of the reasons why Tribune, when I worked for them, they were completely transparent about the idea that they did not want to spend money on players to make a run for a championship, because it would actually ruin their business model, which was to keep the costs down, keep the profit margin high, because people were showing up and people were watching and listening to the games regardless of whether they won or not. So, yeah.
Well, that you just said. That's exactly why the Cubs never won anything in over 100 years.
Yeah. So they fixed from the inside. In this case, it's fixing like neutering. It's like
in a very real way. And we've seen it in other teams too. I mean, the Miami Marlins just basically dumped their whole roster this season after building this massive stadium because they don't want to field a competitive team, apparently.
Right. Interesting. Well, so on to the new book. Congratulations on Disaster Government, National Emergencies, Continuity of Government, and You. Is this available everywhere?
Not everywhere, but it is at Amazon. It's at Barnes & Noble. It's available for Kindle.
Okay.
I'm trying to get it out there to more and more outlets, but those 2 biggies so far.
Well, I hope the blurb I wrote for you on the back of the book isn't holding it back. So, feel free to block that out or use a Sharpie and just kind of cross out my comments. But, I think that's the interesting thing when I was reading an earlier version of your argument in Disaster Government is I love how much you do your research, and you're not just doing derivative stuff, or you're not just, kind of the loudmouth guy at the end of the bar. You really do the heavy lifting here, trying to make your case. And I think you do it very effectively. We may be left to even get into some areas coming up when we get to phone calls later on that you didn't get to in Disaster Government, but I don't know what that is yet. Your argument in a nutshell is that this tradition of exploiting executive orders goes back to even before we were officially a country, right? Yeah. I mean, Washington did this sort of thing. There has always been an attempt by presidents to use disasters or emergencies to manipulate the government and the powers of their offices while they could get away with it.
I think they tried to do it and have been able to do it because disaster and what became known as a national emergency wasn't enumerated in the Constitution. So it's kind of a vague area, and that actually is more and more executive orders have been written and more planning has come about because of national emergencies. It gets more and more vague because it gives them more and more room to operate and do what they feel and do what they will. And that's why I think, like you say, dating back to the days of George Washington, he was able to get away with certain things, and really who really took advantage of it all and really pressed it was Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War.
Yeah.
And that's what changed everything. And really what people see as a problem today with Obama and executive orders really goes all the way back to what Lincoln did, because he was kind of the first one to issue strict executive orders, doing things that he shouldn't have been able to do constitutionally because of the emergency that was the Civil War, and basically because Congress allowed him to do it. And that's really the big problem, is Congress should have taken the power away from him, like when he was basically issuing armies and issuing navies, something that he doesn't have the power to do, and Congress retroactively okayed what he did.
Right.
And that just started the slippery slope that got us to where we are today.
There's references to that in the movie Lincoln, the Spielberg movie.
Yeah.
Where he even talks about, like, I was doing stuff till they told me no. I was just going to keep doing it till they stopped me. And I think that's what people don't realize is that every president, Republican or Democrat, has done this over the last, really, as kind of honed the art under Lincoln, and not always for bad reasons. Sometimes, like in the case of Lincoln, he started essentially creating his own government powers in the name of a national emergency because Congress wasn't there to stop him, because so many people had stopped showing up at Congress because they had seceded.
Well, that's part of the problem with this whole issue in national emergencies and continuity government, too, is the fact it's kind of a double-edged sword, a lot of this information, because if you do have a true emergency, if we got into the Cold War and you've even today had, like, North Korea launch a nuclear missile at us, you don't have time for Congress to get together and come to some sort of conclusion on how to respond to what's occurring. You need someone to act now, and that, the balls always fall into the president to do that. The problem is one of the things they discuss a lot of times in these programs and in these plans is what they call enduring constitutional government. And the problem with that is, or the irony with it is that many times the president and other people are going to act outside of constitutional bounds to respond to the emergency to supposedly ensure constitutional government. And is that right or is that wrong? It's hard to say.
Right. Except that, I guess, going back to Lincoln, and we can see a parallel underneath Roosevelt as well with what happened with FDR and the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the lining up of Japanese Americans and sending them into internment camps. But under Lincoln, that same thought that all of these different, sort of paranoia was at this at a heightened sense because, and we can look back and see maybe he wasn't so crazy to be so paranoid, but there really weren't systems in place that really could have stopped the threat that existed to the government. There weren't systems that could do it. So he was just kind of making it up as he went along as something presented itself, for right or for wrong. At least it seems like at the end of the day, the things which he was trying to do seemed to be in order to keep the country together. Other presidents, maybe not so much. Things that they were doing was because they just wanted to do it, and they didn't necessarily have any higher motives.
Yeah, I think that's true. Lincoln did seem to be kind of winging it in a very real sense. And I think later on, Teddy Roosevelt was one of the soon after Lincoln presidents who literally said, if Congress isn't going to do what needs to be done, I've basically been charged by the people to do what needs to get done. And he started doing things himself through executive orders.
Right.
And FDR kind of picked up the ball, especially, like you said, during World War II. And he issued the most executive orders out of any president ever. And he was issuing them he averaged like 1.5 executive order for each day in office. He issued some, I think want to say it was like 3,000 executive orders during his time. And the trends just kind of kept continued because, again, Congress never took back the power that it should have. And in effect, the executive orders have almost become laws. Even though legally they're not, they kind of act that way today. It's kind of a frightening thing because it is giving way too much power to the person sitting in the presidency.
Well, let's give an example of that, of what people think of today as being something that might even be constitutionally guaranteed, but it really isn't. Well,
I think really you could go right to the heart of the matter, and this national emergency thing. And I've asked people in other interviews, and I know you've read the books, so I don't really want to ask you because you know the answer, but what is a national emergency? And the fact is it's an undefined term.
Right.
It's just something that supposedly the only closest definition ever came from Reagan's era when he called it a national security emergency, which meant something that threatened national security could be deemed a national emergency. And the problem is if a national emergency is declared, and today, right now, we are under 25 separate national emergencies, it gives the president a lot of leeway to do things that he shouldn't be able to do.
Okay, but pause that. Wait. Pause that for a second, because you need to amplify that. We are currently under 25 national emergencies?
By my last count at the end of 2012.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I saw that on the list and broke down by presidencies. So what are the ones that are currently still active as national emergencies? I think this is the one where it was like the Ivory Coast and Zimbabwe and other ones too.
Exactly. That's the strange part of it all is, for example, the events of 9/11 are still a national emergency today. So 12 years later, which they shouldn't be. That national emergency should have ended like the day or the day after. But what gets weirder is you get into, like you say, a situation in Zimbabwe is a national emergency. Situation in Iran is a national emergency. Situation in North Korea is a national emergency. Situation in Syria, in like the Ivory Coast and several other countries are considered national emergencies. But yet Hurricane Sandy was not a national emergency. Hurricane Katrina is not a national emergency. Earthquakes that happened on the West Coast are not national emergencies. And so it's really counterintuitive as to what is and what is not.
Well, and the Hurricane Katrina thing in particular seemed like it would be because of the threat that existed to our oil supply.
You would think so, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
I can't make this stuff up. That's the scary part of it all.
And what's the national emergency for Zimbabwe, for the United States in Zimbabwe?
Well, who knows? Because it's not defined in the actual declaration. It's basically just the situation there could potentially threaten our national security here. And what I think it is, and why all these different locales around the world have been declared national emergencies in the United States, is it's basically a pretext for war. Because the Korean War, which wasn't really a declared war, was actually a national emergency declared by Truman, and that became the Korean War. And I think that's the same thing today, is it basically allows the president to set up a military action. And even more frightening is if you declare a national emergency by law, and I forget the exact law, but there is a law on the books, the president can operate under that national emergency outside of any budget constraints. So when you have a national emergency based on the weapons of mass destruction or the terrorists that threaten the Middle East peace process, which are both national emergencies right now, he can spend untold billions of dollars on those national emergencies outside of any sort of budget constraints that may exist.
Okay, and when did we have about 30 seconds here, when did the national emergency for Zimbabwe in the United States, who enacted that? Was President Bush?
I believe it was Bush, and every year, which is by law has to be done, they're renewed every year. So it's been renewed by Obama at least 4 times now.
At least 4 times. How about that? Okay, but here's what I want you to do, and I'll give you a break to put it together, is come back and read all 25 of the national emergencies that we're currently under in the United States. It'll blow your mind. And then we'll get to some of the ones that aren't still national emergencies, which you'll remember, and what came about as a result of them, how they were manipulated. Coming up next, Disaster Government on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. So we'll get back to Disaster Government coming up in just a second with Brian Tuohy. Order his book by going to coasttocoastam.com. You can also find out more about my book, too, coming up. And thank you so much for ordering early. Makes me look good. And yeah, you know what? I think I might have, I don't know whether it'll ever be a bestseller, but it's certainly getting a lot of attention from some very interesting corners. And may it always be so. Northern L Productions tweeting back to me at Deacon Punnett on Twitter. Also, Sophia Night Warden and Jackie Boone, amongst the many people who were talking about this show 0 Hour. So this came up during open lines because 0 Hour with Anthony Edwards got canceled after only 3 episodes. So I was reading some of the reviews, and they're just terrible. They're beating up on the show so badly. But Sophia said, I know somebody who is an extra on 0 Hour. He actually thought it was awful. Says a lot, don't you think? Jacob said, actually, Ian, sci-fi is in bit of a drought on TV. Fringe had its finale in January. So good. Thank you for that correction. Becky said 0 hours acting and or script writing was deplorable, which is too bad because the premise looked very promising. Brett said pretty much the same thing. 0 hour was stupid. Acting was wooden, and the whole kidnapped wife thing driving the entire plot angle was so hackneyed. Ugh. Chris says, thanks for the Buffalo Springfield, and thank you, everybody, for staying in touch through Twitter. We'll do that again. Tweeting regularly back and forth every other day or so if you follow. But we'll also follow some of your questions, too. And if you want to tweet them in, I'll get to them before the end of the show about disaster government. Brian Tuohy reads the list of the 25 current national emergencies that are active right now. You just never heard of some of these. Coming up next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. All right, so again, find out more by going to our website, coasttocoastam.com, and link up to Brian Tuohy and get this book launched right. Share it with other people, too. You'll be fascinated by the detail that Brian has uncovered. And I want to get to another aspect of your subtitle here, not just about national emergencies, but also about the continuity of government story, because that's really compelling, especially during the 1980s. But let's go over what are currently listed as our national emergencies. You good with that?
Sure.
Okay. In order, then, the 25 national emergencies still actively declared and annually renewed by President Barack Obama. Some of these have been in place for, Brian, how long? What's the longest one on the list?
I think one goes back perhaps beyond Clinton to the first Bush administration.
All right, go ahead. Here's the list.
I think I only have 24, by the way. I don't know if I have all 25.
We'll have another 25 before the half hour is over.
Exactly. Number one, we have terrorists who threaten the Middle East peace process, the situation in Cote d'Ivoire, Cuba, Zimbabwe. There's two relating to Iran. There's one relating to Somalia, Syria, the, quote, stabilization of Iraq, unquote, Burma, the Western Balkans, Belarus, North Korea, the risk of nuclear proliferation in the Russian Federation, the former Liberian regime of Charles Taylor, which if it's a former regime, you don't think it would be that threatening.
Yeah, really?
Lebanon, export control regulations, which is the one that's been around forever. Another North Korean one. There's one it's called Certain Terrorist Attacks, which is actually an ongoing one from 9/11. Another one I'd love titled just Persons Who Commit or Threaten to Commit or Support Terrorism. Then there's narcotic traffickers centered in Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, just another blanket one of weapons of mass destruction. And then, like I said, there's two Iranian ones, and there's actually 3 Iranian ones. I take that back.
You're missing the Chicago Cubs. Wasn't that on there too? Isn't that one of our national emergencies?
I think for President Obama, it would be Rose not being on the Bulls. I think that
yeah, exactly. So, I think some of that has to be, a lot of those have to be CIA driven, right? I mean, this is some sort of cover story for what the CIA is doing to give them some sort of legal cover in some of these. It just seems like it has clandestine operation written all over it.
Well, that's why I said I think a lot of this is almost like a pretext to some sort of military action, because the wording of the executive orders, and you can go online and find these. I mean, they're on the White House website, and then there's other websites that list all the executive orders out there. And people can read them, and that's what I did. I just started going through them and digging all these out. And you read them, they're very, like I say, just kind of bland. Just like there's a national emergency, this is the reason why. And it doesn't really say how they're going to effectively combat the national emergency. And, in fact, they don't effectively combat the national emergency because, like the whole list I read to you, all of those really, I think, date back to the Bush administration. So if after 5 years, how is it still an emergency?
Right. Except like for the same reason, and this one of these great historical trivia questions, which you reference in the book, that World War II didn't actually end until the 1950s.
Yeah.
right? I mean, what was the 50-51 for Japan and Germany?
Yeah, I think Germany was first, and then Japan was like a year or two later. Yeah, it was in the 50s.
But the reason why for that was because, at least in the case of Germany, and I don't know about Japan, but in Germany, that there was still a commitment from these cells, right, and from these lone wolves and from these guerrilla groups out there that were going to disrupt the peace, and they knew that they were still operating, or that they were, theoretically, they were still trying to follow Nazis along the rat line or whatever, that there was still, at least you could see, like there was some residual reason why they may have needed to have special powers in dealing in Germany. But that's so I get that one. What I don't get is that I don't even think that we're in some of these countries where they're having a national emergency. Like, how can you be in a former government, like the former government of Charles Taylor? You know what I mean? How can you be?
I mean, we don't know we're in Zaire. We don't know, we're in a lot of these places. Congo. It's just, like you say, it's an open invitation to do other things. And what those other things are remain to be seen. What the scary part is, I put in my book, which I think we'll talk about, is what the president can really do if he wanted to in the face of a national emergency.
Well, Brian, let me ask you, what can the president do if he or she wanted to in the face of a national emergency?
Well, the really scary part is he could literally ration energy, food, and water in the United States. He could control the airwaves. He could confiscate your personal vehicle and control the airwaves, the auto waves, the waterways, and the airplane ways, if you want to, as well. He can control your personal electromagnetic device, including your iPod, your laptop computer, and what have you. And he can literally force you to work on certain projects for a certain wage wherever they deem necessary in the event of a national emergency. And considering we're under 25 of them, you have to be a little worried.
Now, some people have gotten sidetracked, I think, in this conversation, and this has come up before on Coast to Coast, and gotten obsessed with FEMA and thinking of FEMA as being a government within a government, like a shadow government. And while there may be some truth to that, you don't need FEMA for the president to be able to do those things you just mentioned.
Well, you need someone, though. I mean, that's, I think, one of the safety nets we have in the country is that because really all this paperwork, all this legislation, all these executive orders really literally set up a legal coup, a legal overthrow of the government if somebody wanted to take it that far. And all you would need is a national emergency as the tipping point to set all of this stuff in motion. What's holding it back is it would be very hard for President Obama to take over the United States based off what's going on in Zimbabwe.
Right.
Because I don't think a lot of people would rally around him and go, okay, sure. You would need some sort of major catastrophic event to really set all this stuff in motion and then for people to back them. But I think that's the key, is that FEMA, for example, I mean, there's only 6,000 employees that FEMA has nationwide. And we've seen it just in their ability to respond to a disaster like Hurricane Sandy. If you sent all 6,000 of those people to New York City after Hurricane Sandy, they would not have been able to help the 10 million plus people in need of relief. I mean, If you sent everybody, they wouldn't have been able to do it. I mean, I'm sorry. And so really, does FEMA need to exist? I don't think it does.
Well,
I don't think it can handle the task because it's just not staffed that way and it's not run that way.
Well, and that proves my point. That, again, I think FEMA becomes sort of a false positive. That you look at FEMA and you think, oh, then it's like some sort of shadow government, but it actually is fairly feeble. And if history tells us anything, the president can use almost any organization to implement these goals. So, what was the thing that it's been a while since I read it, so help me with my memory on this. What was it that Roosevelt found in some weird commerce clause that allowed the presidency to exploit? I mean, it was like some obscure, I dog-eared the page and I can go back and find it, but it was like literally like in the charter for why a government agency existed, they were able to use that to get around Congress telling the president no. And he found, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I vaguely remember it.
Let me see if I can find it.
the book, but it's the same thing. It was, if I remember right, you're talking about with Woodrow Wilson.
Yes, but it was...
FDR worked in the Department of Navy, and he found some sort of, like you said, it was in like an obscure law or regulation within the Navy that allowed the president, basically, I think it was to arm merchant ships.
That's what it was. It was to arm
not to do.
Right after the Lusitania. And before our involvement in World War I. That was it. And so they used just the charter of this group to arm the ships, and he found something that had been not specific enough to stop him to do the justification, and just simply walked around Congress who had told him no.
Yeah, and that, too, was based off a national emergency. That was one that was declared by Wilson at the time that allowed them to do that as well. It was like, I think that was the wording, is he had to declare a national emergency for this to be allowable, and FDR found how to put all these together before he was even president, and then once he became president, he just took those ideas and ran with them to an extreme extent.
Well, obviously, we're seeing the same sort of debate again with the whole drone war question. Like, can the president of the United States order a drone on domestic soil to kill a U.S. citizen? And on the surface of that may seem absurd. Like, of course, the president can't do that. But got to find the law that actually says no. I mean, that the way the drone laws were written, maybe they were vague enough to allow for something like that.
Well, the hope is that the Constitution will rule above and beyond everything else. I don't think it is, unfortunately, but it should. I mean, the right to due process and, basically, was it the punishment clause as well? It should stop the president from being able to blow up somebody who's suspected terrorist sitting in their house here in the United States. I mean, that's just the way it should be. Like, as they, got on Rand Paul's case, some of the other congressmen said he shouldn't even have had to ask the question. Well, unfortunately, he did have to ask the question because he wasn't getting a straight answer.
Right.
And for him, that was concerning, and for a lot of other congressmen, it was concerning as well. But a lot of that, too, again, it almost goes back to this whole national emergency idea, whereas, given this strange state of the war on terrorism we're in, it has kind of opened up the doors to a lot of things that the president and the government and the military, in fact, shouldn't be able to do, but we're kind of allowing them to do them just because apparently we're afraid of these people. And to me, it doesn't seem that of a frightening of an aspect because, I mean, you could commit terrorism in the United States very easily in a very small budget way, and yet nothing is occurring.
Right. Yeah. Although I think it all comes down to, again, the political cowardice of our legislative branch, because they could get in the middle of any of these things if they had the guts to do it. I mean, Rand Paul's filibuster aside, right? I mean, that's the lesson of history, is that Congress could roll up its sleeves and start to go through these executive orders, and they could demand a hearing, and they could do all sorts of stuff but they're not interested in doing that. I mean,
definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right, because, one of the things I bring up in the book is the National Emergency Act of 1976. And that was what they found at the time was the United States at that time was under 4 national emergencies. One dating all the way back from 1933 that FDR instituted, another one which was the Korean War, which that national emergency hadn't ended yet, and 2 that Nixon had implemented. And Congress at that time said, all right, we passed this National Emergency Act that's going to end these 4 national emergencies, and it's going to set up this rule for how national emergencies have to be declared. And once they're declared, a president would have to renew them, announce that he's renewing them at the end of every year. Now, that should have curtailed the, usage of national emergencies. Instead, it exploded it.
Right.
I mean, it just went exponential afterwards, and it doesn't make sense. Why? Because they did actually act, Congress acted, and, stopped what was going on, but instead it just created a whole new problem.
Well, I think this probably is a good time to transition into the continuity of government concept, and we can go back to national emergencies. Again, we're talking about the book Disaster Government, National Emergencies, Continuity of Government, and you, Brian Tuohy, is the author. You can link up to this book by going to coasttocoastam.com. So, Brian, the continuity of government, or COG as it's called, this is a concept which has been around for a long time. There's certain aspects and certain periods of this fixation on continuity of government which can kind of stand out. Not everybody is fascinated with it, perhaps. And so you'll have to explain from the very beginning, when did this concept of continuity of government start, and who started to refine it to where it is today?
It basically was birthed after World War II, because if you believe the straight history that we were surprised with what happened at Pearl Harbor, after World War II, the federal government said, well, we can't let that happen again, and if it happens again, what if somebody attacked Washington, D.C.? What would we do? And so they started to create these plans and develop these relocation sites, they call them, which a lot of times are underground bases, to survive any sort of disaster or potential attack from an enemy. And that throughout the Cold War just built up and got more and more and more extreme. And the basic idea is very sound. It's if you want the government, well, basically what it is, you need the government to survive in order to protect the country and protect the citizens. And again, it's another double-edged sword where if you think about it in saving the pure form of the American government, if you think about saving the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the land of the free and the home of the brave and all that good stuff, continuity of government is a great idea. But a lot of people today see it kind of as a conspiracy theory because what you're going to wind up saving is like the current administration and the current screwed up way this federal government seems to operate today. And that's the problem, is it's not necessarily saving the pure form, although that's what it's designed to do. It's basically going to save what we have.
Right. Or save a lot of lives of the more powerful congressmen.
Well, not necessarily, because one thing that was revealed on 9/11 was that because these plans developed over years and they spent billions of dollars on them, a lot of them are extremely top secret. And they're so top secret that members of Congress don't even know what the plan is. And well, that's problematic. If you're going to have a disaster plan, a plan to save everybody, a survival plan, and nobody knows what it is and nobody knows how to implement it, you have serious problems.
Yeah, but I thought that there was a reason why West Virginia was getting a lot of this underground bunker action, and a lot of the secret sites were going to West Virginia because of certain powerful congressmen and senators from West Virginia that was steering it their way.
Well, that is true, but at the same time, one of the things I bring up in the book is that, and I forget the senator's name, I think it's DeFazio. He was on the Department of Homeland Security's Oversight Committee, and President Bush issued a bunch of continuity government orders and plans, and the senator wanted to read them, and he wasn't allowed access to them. Now, he's a senator. He's on the Oversight Committee for the Department of Homeland Security, which was put in charge of continuity government programs. And he's not allowed to see what's in these documents. Again, that's just wrong. And that's the thing is, I mean, again, on 9/11, when that occurred, there actually happened in Washington, D.C. to be a meeting of all the federal-level judges, Supreme Court, the head of the circuit courts, basically the entire judiciary branch of the federal government was meeting on 9/11 in Washington, D.C., and the security came in, they grabbed the Chief Justice and left. They left the other 8 Supreme Court members behind and everybody else behind, and they didn't tell anybody what was happening. And all the judges just slowly wandered out into the street to realize what was going on.
Yeah, it pays to be in the chain of command, I think, at that point. All right, well, then hang on for the second, because I want to get back to then the COG, the continuity of government, as it was refined in the 80s under President Reagan. Very interesting. Disaster government, national emergencies, continuity of government, and you on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. So exploring the story of disaster government, what does that really mean? And how have national emergencies been used historically and today to manipulate the American public specifically? And it is specifically the American government that's being preserved by COG, the continuity of government idea. And this enjoyed quite a bit of attention during the 1980s. We'll tell you what resulted from that and what's the residual effect? What does continuity of government mean to us today? Coming up next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. So Brian Tuohy is available at coasttocoastam.com. Link up to him there. We'll also take your calls coming up next hour. Not ready yet. Continuity of government. That's in the subtitle of disaster government. And so it kind of gets its start after World War II in the Cold War era. There are certain people who are part of the continuity of government and certain people who aren't. But let's talk about the 80s, because I thought that the part about a lot of the orders from President Ronald Reagan around continuity of government, I thought that showed a kind of a unique insight into where we were as a country back then.
Well, Reagan really did ramp the whole program up. It seemed like It had, really peaked originally around Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then kind of ebbed away until Reagan came into office. And he took it to another level and started running all sorts of programs, all sorts of tests to the continuity government, and tried to ensure that everything was working as it would necessarily need to when, the Russians and us started nuclear war with each other, because it seemed to be really on the forefront of Reagan's mind for some reason. And it's kind of interesting that two of the main players in these war games at the time were Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, who on 9/11, because of the training they had literally back to Reagan era, remembered what to do in the event of a national emergency like that. And those were the two guys who were really directing people to get out of Washington, D.C. into these relocation sites like Mount Weather and Raven Rock, because they knew that if this was really something bigger than it wound up being, that these people needed to get out of Washington, D.C., and they needed to be set up in the right positions to respond.
And so the kind of, you have to go, you can't just say, well, I want to do more of this. In the 80s, you had to have, somebody had to be sort of the master planner for what wasn't being done for continuity of government work, what needed to be, how were you going to get it done, and who was going to be in and who was going to be out?
The two people that seemed to be most responsible, and what happened was it seemed like FEMA and the National Security Council kind of merged on this idea, and it put two people in charge. One was Oliver North, of all people, and the other one was the director of FEMA at the time, and the guy by the name of Louis, I think it's pronounced Gafrida. And Gafrida was a really kind of a strange character who wanted to make FEMA basically the lead instrument in instituting martial law in the United States in the event, again, of a national emergency. And FEMA was even smaller then than it is now, so for them to consider even martial law at all seemed absurd, because they're not even a military organization. They're not even an armed organization by any stretch of the imagination. But with Oliver North getting involved in the National Security Council, that whole notion started to change. And then they started running what they call these readiness exercises. And the most famous one is this one known as Readiness Exercise 84, or Rex 84, and that's the one where it simulated rounding up potentially 400,000 illegal immigrants, which many people have taken to believe that they weren't really illegal immigrants they were rounding up, but potentially practicing rounding up American citizens.
Right. And this practice that went on, I mean, they were obviously, again, this was something which was being done by executive order. What are the things were done under Reagan that we may not have thought of as, typical of his presidency, that he did, like every other president before and after him have done when it comes to using executive orders to get what he wanted?
Well, Reagan, one of the things he instituted is one of the things that I found humorous, actually, was he updated some executive orders that had been rewritten by Nixon that were originally done by Kennedy, and those were the orders I kind of mentioned before, where it gave the government the power to confiscate and ration food, water, and energy and force you to work in certain locations and that sort of thing. He rewrote all those executive orders, and he wrote them in a really kind of vague, obscure way. And he just asked for these different departments and these different secretaries to have, adequate responses in place. I mean, he wasn't being as strict as Kennedy was, who was really laying out the law, saying you need to be ready for nuclear war, you need to prepare to respond, you need to know what's going to happen. He was like, you just need to be adequately prepared for the event of emergency. And he, again, made it very vague so that, the head of the Department of Energy was in control of everything energy-related and can basically had a free reign over what was necessary at that time.
And he had to come up with something because the president had told him, come up with something. So
exactly.
That's kind of a fun day in your job when you get to, get around a 3-martini lunch with the rest of the people in the office and come up with your wish list of the things that you're going to try and do.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, and they had all these weird plans in place. I mean, one of the things that, like we talk about relocation sites, they have this other notion beyond continuity government called continuity of operations, and that's kind of a subset of continuity of government, which is the entire federal government. Continuity of operations is just about each individual department, and each one has supposedly 3 relocation sites, an A site, a B site, and a C site, and it's basically the idea is if the A site gets blown up, for example, then the B site people will take over, and if B site people get blown up, then the C site people will take over. And that's how far they went. And I mean, we're talking every department of the federal government has the sort of continuity of operations program supposedly in place.
Right.
And one of the funniest things to me is it always talks about in these continuity of operation programs is that they just want to make sure that they do the essential functions and get the essential functions taken care of. And I think, well, shouldn't really technically everything they do be an essential function?
Right.
There's that many unessential functions that they do that they have to tell people just make sure you know how to do the essential functions. I mean, that's bureaucracy in action, apparently.
I was thinking of your book when I was watching Live Free or Die Hard the other day, because they were showing it on whatever. And that's the Die Hard movie, in which they talk about what's called the fire sale, right? Which is the theory that you could come in and you could shut down the whole government, and that if you switched off power in certain places, and that you could essentially take control of the entire U.S. government fairly painlessly just using cyber terrorism, right?
Yeah.
And I thought what was interesting is that in the book, at least in the movie, that they were showing that there were still certain amounts of these redundant systems that seemed pretty easy to pop into place, like, trailers with these command centers, with these highly, electronic command centers that were all you had, they popped a generator and suddenly they were back online again. And I'm thinking to myself, God, I hope that's true. Somehow, I imagine much more like a trailer like you would see at a used car lot. Like it would just be a place to get out of the rain. Not really that technically savvy. And I hope I'm wrong on that. But so when you talk about sites A, B, C, and D, that gives me hope that maybe we've got a little bit more going for us than just, a microwave and a bun coffee maker for some of these agency department heads.
Well, I hope you're right, too. I mean, it's kind of two different things on this. One is I relay in the book, which I actually saw on, I think it was a History Channel program, where when 9/11 occurred, Laura Bush's chief of staff organized basically all the White House staff. And despite all this continuity government planning that dates back to World War II and all the billions of dollars spent and the relocation sites that were built and all this planning and running tests and evacuation plans and evacuation routes, Laura Bush's chief of staff gathered everyone in the White House and literally said, "Run for your lives."
Not really.
No, yeah. That's what she said on the program. I quoted directly from the book. She basically told them, "Run for your lives."
Run for your lives.
But at the same time, these relocation sites are literally underground cities.
Yeah.
Some people talking about them, and not many people do talk about them. And that's, people say you can't keep secrets and you can't keep things under wraps. Well, people have built massive underground relocation sites that literally have 3 or 4 story buildings inside them, and nobody's talking about what goes on there. Nobody's talking about who's staffed there, how many people are staffed there, what they have. But they literally have their own, energy generators. They have their own water supplies. They have room for upwards of maybe 2,000 people to stay for 6 months to a year. I mean, these are well-stocked, large locations, and nobody who built them, nobody who works there talks about them.
And if we don't use them, they'll likely fall into the hands of the mole men. So,
quite possibly.
Last thing we need is to empower King Goddard the Squinty at this point for him to take over all of our secret underground bases,
Well, that's where the whole secret shadow government idea comes from, I believe. Is supposedly, like at Mount Weather, there supposedly is an ongoing staff that works and lives kind of underground. Now, again, this is something that hasn't been totally 100% confirmed, but it's pretty well confirmed as being real, and that these people who work there are substitutes, unelected, uneven really appointed substitutes for the heads of the large departments, Department of State, Department of Defense, all those, and that they're addressed as Mr. or Miss Secretary even when they're down there. But they're not the actual secretaries. They're the replacements should the secretaries get blown up or taken out in whatever event occurs.
Well, maybe they can figure out this whole stupid sequester thing. So, again, we're talking about disaster government, national emergencies, continuity of government, and you. So we've talked about all the different presidents and all of the different programs, some of which that they were that they seem to be kind of a reflection of their interests, like, you know, what they were really obsessed over. They used their executive orders to get. Looking over the history of the president, the last 5 or 6 presidents, who do you think has the best understanding of the need for disaster preparedness? Or are they all sort of equally selfish, egocentric dictators in this way?
Well, do you mean for like natural disaster preparedness?
Yeah, just as you see these executive orders and using national emergencies, is there anybody that seemed to be driving it up the middle in a way that didn't seem to be manipulating, you know, current events in order to get what they want?
Not necessarily, because if you can really look at FEMA's history, which dates back to 1979 and Jimmy Carter, who established FEMA. And FEMA, because it is supposedly the emergency response mechanism for the federal government, has been really misguided in many, many ways. And it's like it never had a good direction, because it came in one sense from civil defense planning in the 1960s, and on the other side, it came from a natural disaster response. And the funding that went to FEMA was supposed to fund both sides of it, and yet whoever was like in power would push it more towards terrorism or would push it more towards natural disaster, and it usually was after something bad happened, and that's how the money would be spent. But they never had someone really in charge of FEMA who knew what they were doing. I mean, actually, Obama probably has the best person in charge of FEMA of anybody in history, because what he has is a former fire chief, I think, of Miami. His last name is Fugate, I think, or Fugat. And he actually has some, you know, fire and rescue and emergency response background, where a lot of the guys, like the guy Bush had in charge of it during Hurricane Katrina, his background was running like an Arabian horse association.
Right.
That we put in charge of FEMA, and of course then we saw Hurricane Katrina hit, and FEMA didn't know what to do. Well, the guy in charge didn't know what to do.
They saved the horses.
Yeah, exactly. But why was it a surprise that the government's response was so haphazard when you have a guy in charge who doesn't know what he's supposed to do in an emergency?
Right. Because it had always been seen as just being a political appointment, not one that, right? I mean, it was just kind of one of those throwaway agencies that they didn't necessarily really expect to do too much.
Yeah, I mean, some of the other people, I think, like President Clinton had a guy in there who he kind of refined FEMA to its original idea, was that it was an all-hazard response idea. It was that no matter what the disaster is, and it's true, whether it's a terrorist attack, whether it's a biological, chemical attack, a hurricane, an earthquake, what have you, everybody needs food, water, and shelter. It's pretty basic. And that's how this guy who, I can't remember his name, who was under Clinton, ran it. This is what we need. We just need to help people get there and help people and take care of the problem. But that idea would be lost, because after Clinton got out of office, the guy was replaced, and that whole idea went out the window again. And that's what a lot of the problem is people get mad, people at Hurricane Katrina and people in Hurricane Sandy and other people affected by the floods in the Midwest and what have you, get mad at the federal government because they think FEMA's there to help them. But I think what they fail to recognize, and FEMA even tells people if they go to their website, you need to be prepared for at least 3 days to survive on your own before anybody from the government's going to come and help you.
Yeah, that's a theme that we hit a lot here on Coast to Coast, that it pays just to be prepared for something like that, whether that's, batteries, a wind-up radio, a way to make potable water, to be able to have some basic foodstuffs to get by. That there's many sponsors that we have here on Coast to Coast that you don't have to have a month's worth, and you're very likely not going to survive a nuclear dystopian society based on supplies that are in your basement. But you can get by for a couple of days until help arrives, and that's not a bad thing to be prepared for, and times however many people are in your family, too.
No, exactly. But I think FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees FEMA, could do a much better job of telling people that.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things, is they spend all this money on making all these different response teams, and there's all kinds of response teams. In fact, one of the things I talk about in the book is how supposedly they already have plans in place to respond to a hurricane, an earthquake, and all these other disasters or terrorist-type attacks. And yet, even though they have these plans in place, when you see Hurricane Sandy hit, they're completely clueless as to what to do.
Right.
How good are these plans? And who made them and why?
Again, it comes back to politics, though, too. I think that's the political piece on some of this. They may have plans that they could implement if there were no political implications for doing so. And I don't know whether I don't know whether that's true or not, but we also know that sometimes as soon as enough of the right people pipe up and say, hey, where's the help? Suddenly the help shows up, True. And
it's very good. Yeah, it's a very good political thing to do.
So just to circle back then to where we started with that, the truth of it is, whereas it would fit nicely into some people's narratives that a Republican administration would be less inclined to use executive orders to get what it wants. It would be much more of a strict constructionist when it comes to the Constitution. It wouldn't be looking for cheap excuses to go outside of the Constitution to get what it wants. Or the other way to look at that is that Democrats would never use fear to get what they wanted through executive orders. Bottom line is, history shows us none of that's true. Everybody just gets what they can, right? And there is there are no white hats or black hats when it comes to executive orders from presidents.
Yeah, that's one of the things I point out in the book. It's both sides.
Yeah, and if you don't know that yet, you're missing part of the beauty of that. Now, I want to go back to, we've been talking a little bit about recent stuff, and I know we're going to spend a lot of time in there when we get to some questions coming up in about 30 minutes. But before we get there, there's a couple of very interesting historical abuses that Brian has hinted at that I want to go back to. We'll start with Korea. And then we'll also, I think, in fairness too, I want to address Vietnam as well. Disaster government, national emergencies, continuity of government, and you will be welcome to call coming up in about 30 minutes. We'll give you the numbers next hour. Hang on for that, because I'd love to hear what you have to say about it on the way on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Hey, listen, we'll get back to disaster government coming up in just a second. National emergencies, continuity of government, and you. I forgot to mention something for those of you, and I do occasionally hear from people who are pipe smokers. I enjoy a bowl now and again, and I wrote a piece that has to do with radio and pipes, and it's coming out in the next edition of Pipes and Tobacco magazine. So I kept meaning to go to a newsstand and see whether it's out there yet, or to go to a pipe shop or a cigar shop in my neighborhood. And the last time I went, it wasn't quite out, but I thought I'd heard from Chuck Stanion, who's the editor-in-chief, and I think it's out now. So if you're inclined to go to a cigar shop, take a look at Pipes and Tobacco magazine. There's a piece in there about microphones and pipes, and I'll just let that hang out there because it kind of works together once you see the pictures. It's pretty cool. And so's this book, Disaster Government, National Emergencies, Continuity of Government, and You. And let's talk about war and national emergencies coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Disaster Government author Brian Tuohy. We'll take your calls coming up in just a few minutes. But let's go back to the Korean War, because for a long time there was a national emergency in regard to North Korea that remained on the books, and yet it was a national emergency that was used to essentially for our involvement from the very beginning on this.
Yeah, the national emergency on Korea, I believe, started in 1950, I want to say. And it actually didn't end until 1976 when the National Emergencies Act ended it. But Korea was, in fact, it wasn't a declared war by Congress. In fact, Congress did absolutely nothing in regards to the Korean War. I mean, it didn't really endorse it. It didn't tell Truman to stop it. Congress basically sat there and let it take place. And it was all done under the guise of a national emergency.
And what we were doing was a police action, right?
Well, I don't know if it was really called a police action, but it was a fear that the situation was a grave threat to America. And I think even Truman said it was a grave threat to the world and the United Nations on top of it. and that the United States had to act in order to, secure the world peace in a way, I guess.
Yeah, I think it was called a police action. At least it was in MASH. So I think that's what Truman originally called it. And that's how they could get away with essentially having it be a non-declared war, that it was a national emergency and we were responding to it as though we were police being called to the scene.
That could very well be, but I think in his actual declaration, he talked about it basically trying to stop the spread of communism.
Right.
I think that's what he referred to it as. But yeah, I could see it would be the same rationale.
But then once the ball gets rolling, again, like we've seen in other patterns, nobody in Congress is willing to do or say something that might be unpopular or might put them on the wrong side of their electorate. So they don't do anything at all. Just continue to let it roll on until eventually it plays itself out. And yet then that pattern is repeated with the Vietnam War. Now, where did national emergencies play a part in the development of the Vietnam War, or didn't it?
It did not. That's the odd part, is even though it worked effectively, I guess, if you want to call it that, from a presidential standpoint in the Korean War, the Vietnam War was never declared a national emergency, and none of that power was used on Vietnam. Now, similar powers were used by the president on the American populace during that time in terms of kind of martial law,
right,
the Comitatus Act situations, but it wasn't effective really in the country or what created the Vietnam War at all.
Well, see, that's what I was getting at, was that there was a sense of the national emergencies on the college campuses across the country. And I was just watching a clip again of Richard Nixon in a documentary the other day talking about that the problem was not the war that we were fighting. It was the fact that, here were these protesters, and protesters were on the streets and they were trying to take over our country. So I'm surprised that didn't become that protesting in the streets wasn't counted as a national emergency.
It was very close, though. I mean, they did, on, I believe, 2 occasions, basically issue kind of like an Insurrection Act proclamation that allowed military troops to actually act as a police force within the United States, which is illegal under the Posse Comitatus Act, which dates back to the Civil War. But I believe they did it after, during like riots after Martin Luther King's death, and also I think after the riots after the invasion of Cambodia, which you played the song Ohio, which related to the Kent State shooting, which killed 4 students there. Those are basically, the military acting as a police force here in the United States, which is technically illegal.
And yet these, as you said, there really weren't any major repercussions for that either. We know that Nixon runs into trouble later on. What were some of the other national emergencies, though, that Nixon did declare, or the ways in which he used that while he was in office?
He only declared 2. One was because of the U.S. postal strike. The postal workers went on strike, and at a time before email and cell phones and even, I think, UPS and some of the other major shipping companies, the stoppage of postal delivery in the United States was a huge deal. And he declared a national emergency that I believe put the National Guard in charge of postal services for a few days until they negotiated the postal worker strike and got them back in action. And the other national emergency was kind of one that I couldn't quite follow because it was a real kind of legalese type of thing, which dealt with import and export controls here in the United States. So, I mean, they weren't anything necessarily related to violence or civil unrest or Vietnam or anything of that nature. They were 2 kind of benign ones, really, in all honesty.
The idea of a national emergency when it comes to labor, that had been done many times before, usually during wartime, or at least that was the excuse, right, to keep people from striking or to keep services flowing.
Well, Truman did a lot of that after World War II, not declaring national emergencies, but using executive orders to force like certain steel mills and mining operations to work regardless of wages and that sort of thing. He used it kind of as a strike-breaking tool. And oddly enough, that actually got shot down by the Supreme Court. And one of the things that the Truman administration tried to fight against the Supreme Court in this argument was using a national emergency. And it was really strange that the Supreme Court shot down their idea of using an executive order and this kind of a national emergency idea on, steel mill workers, but yet at the same time they did absolutely nothing about the Korean War. So it's like it's okay to use to use an executive order to create a war, but it's not okay to use an executive order to make people work.
And there was another example, and if I dog-eared so many pages in Disaster Government, I'd have to go find it in a break. But where you talk about there would be labor issues that were being resolved, or that they were using executive orders, say, to stop people from patronizing certain businesses or to stop being able to sell something overseas. Was that part of the Enemies Act, the trading with the
Enemies Act, which dates to 1917, I believe. And that's one of the tools they use a lot of the times in these national emergencies is the Trading with the Enemies Act to stop people. For example, like today with terrorism, they still invoke the Trading with the Enemies Act, or there's another variation of it. I forget the name of it, but it's basically acts in the same ways. It stops people from funding terrorism or funding these places outside of the United States that have been deemed terrorist, and it prevents them from bringing their money here as well, and they'll freeze assets here in the United States.
But this is done by executive order.
Exactly.
Okay. And that after wars, frequently, even when a president like Woodrow Wilson would have expanded his powers in the presidency, at the end of the presidency, they frequently will give back whatever it was that they took. Right? I mean, this has happened a couple of times where a president has famously said, now I made this executive order because I had to. Now we don't have to do it anymore, so now I'm discontinuing the order. But that idea of trading with the enemies, that somehow survived.
Yeah, that one survived. It really goes back to Woodrow Wilson. During World War I, he passed a lot of, I shouldn't say laws, but a lot of executive orders that were like, some sedition acts and things of that nature, which prevented people really from using their freedom of speech against World War I in the United States.
I mean, by executive order, didn't he make it illegal to speak against the government?
Yes,
right?
In a very real way he did. He even allowed, you couldn't even write certain things in magazines that were going to be sent across state lines, too.
Yeah, because he used the post office to stop people from distributing those things. It wasn't that he made the publications illegal. He just made it illegal to distribute them through the post office.
It was kind of like, making whiskey. It's kind of the same thing. You can't distribute it. But
right.
But, yeah, that's what they did. He did at the end of World War I when he left office rescind all of those. Thank God.
Mm-hmm.
But the Trading with the Enemies Act is one that never was rescinded, but I think that because it was an act of Congress, it wasn't necessarily something that Wilson did on his own. But still, that survives, nearly 100 years later, and it's still used 100 years later for the exact same purposes.
Well, wasn't that an example, or maybe I'm wrong, but I know there were other examples where the president would do something by executive order, and then Congress would follow up later on and undergird it. But if the president hadn't have done it, they wouldn't have. Congress wouldn't have done it. The president did it, made it popular, made it seem like it was necessary, and so Congress harumphed its way into a vote so that they didn't look like Nimrods.
And they did that many times. And it, again, dates back to Lincoln's era, because that's where kind of the tradition started, for better or for worse. Lincoln did a lot of things. And it was interesting. Lincoln could have made Congress reconvene much earlier than he did after the outbreak of the Civil War to get some of these things rolling, to get the Army together and other funding issues, but he didn't. Instead, he just physically did it through his own executive orders. And like you said, later on, Congress came along and said, well, it's kind of hard to stop it now. All this stuff is in motion, so I guess, okay, it passes. Mm-hmm. And again, that was a precedent that continued onwards, where it happened in World War I, it happened in World War II, where the president would just do something because he felt like doing it, and Congress would go, well, yeah, I guess, okay, fine.
Yeah, but this is what builds up the power then of the executive branch under these disaster government models. Is that nobody wants to be perceived as going against the leader, and so the leader is doing something right. The people seem to be buying into it. Then they're going to buy into it too. But that's not how our government is set up. I mean, that's not what it's supposed to be like. So that's part of why this is such an important book for people to consider. It's not full of like a bunch of, you aren't just saber rattling here. I mean, you're really going through, administration by administration, and you're showing how it is that these government powers were expanded by sheer will, and then nobody challenged him on it. So today, this is how we've got it. Now, what do you think could happen realistically when you look forward, knowing what, say, President Obama has as part of the series of executive orders or some of the assumed powers? What do you really think an American president could get away with if he or she were so inclined?
Well, I think if you look at the historical record that I tried to provide in this book, and like you said, that's one of the things I try to hammer home, too, is that none of this is make-believe stuff. I mean, I'm giving you the actual physical documents where even if I only give you a snippet of it, you can go look it up and see.
Oh, but most of the time you don't. You print out, you go through long quotes. Some of them like, Brian, my God, there's like 2 pages of this
I know
quote.
Some of it I probably should have edited it down, but I didn't want to be accused of cherry picking.
No, I get that.
So, you have to read it and you can understand it, and you realize this is what the government is really doing and what it's really capable of doing. And it should kind of shock some people when they read this stuff, because it shocked me. I mean, that's kind of why I wrote the book, is because I kind of did this as a hobby, and then all of a sudden I realized, holy cow, this isn't make-believe. This is real, and nobody's written a book like this. I guess I'm going to do it.
I guess I have to. So
yeah.
what could a president do? Yeah.
That's the thing, is really, given a bad situation, the president has the power to make it a whole lot worse for the citizens of the United States. I mean, he can really, really just trample upon the Constitution because of something. He declares a national emergency. He then can determine how best to respond to this national emergency, and then he can institute all of these. There's literally 22, I believe, what they call standby executive orders that a president could sign into action. And these things do the, worst of the worst. It can suspend due process. It can suspend habeas corpus. And he can basically tell the FBI to go round up a whole mess of dissenters, whether or not they've broken any sort of law, because they could be problematic for the country.
Are there still executive orders that would allow a president to do what Woodrow Wilson did, what Abraham Lincoln did, which is shut down the voice of opposition in media?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, one of the things he can do is he can establish, a code of censorship for definitely. And he can take over the airwaves. I mean, and again, it's kind of a double-edged thing, because people get all freaked out. Like, we had that test, I think, of the National Emergency Broadcast System that was supposedly going to shut down every, TV, radio, and everything to broadcast an emergency signal. Now, I live in the Midwest, if a tornado comes and the tornado siren sounds, they can interrupt whatever I'm watching on TV and say, hey, dummy, there's a tornado coming.
Right.
And that's not all bad. That's a good thing that came out of this, the ability of the government to take over the airwaves, because they can warn you, there's a chemical spill. Something's occurring. You need to be alerted to it. You need to react to it because it's for your own safety. But it can go that extra step where technically the president could take over the airwaves and never relinquish them.
Right.
Broadcast propaganda 24/7. And, that's the way it is because he has that power. And that's how scary it can be.
I'd be curious to see whether or not that's the reason I asked the question the way I did, was I wanted to hear what you had to say about it. I wonder whether, though, there is a greater awareness now of what these powers are, and therefore, unlike, say, under Woodrow Wilson, or unlike, say, during even the Korean War, which was coming right after World War II and right after all these concerns about the Cold War, et cetera, that I wonder whether there would just be so much pushback now that no president could control the internet, or no president could ultimately control any of the media, because it's it's so decentralized. You couldn't just go in and say, we're going to take over these 4 networks and own the media, because they just doesn't exist anymore. And with all of the cellular phone technology and all of, you know what I mean by that, all the bit streaming and other things, whether it's even possible for a president to be able to do what they did so easily 100 years ago.
I think they can. That's what kind of freaks me out. I mean, when you think about media, there's surely I think 5 or 6 corporations that control all the media. I mean, the vast majority of the media, I should say. And I think, the NSA and the National Reconnaissance Office and some of those other, alphabet soup agencies that are out there, I think they have the very real possibility of shutting everything down if they want to. I think they can clamp down very quickly and very easily if they want to. Again, the question is, will they? Will they agree with what some, potentially tyrannical president wants to do, given the right set of circumstances? That's the bigger question.
Okay. Well, I think the good news is, just to see you, there are a lot more than 5 or 6 even large-size media companies out there. And there's enough of them that I think it would keep the president from any president to get a stranglehold on the media. But I think you'll accept also that we have so many more opportunities for people to reach out without going through media, even, that I think that would be tricky. But still, it's a scary enough thought. Disaster government, national emergencies, continuity of government, and you. We have an hour of your calls and Brian Tuohy coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. So here we go into our last hour, and this is the part where things are going to get very festive. The phones are filling up fast. Grab a line, and we'll hook you up with Brian Tuohy, Disaster Government, National Emergencies, Continuity of Government, and you next. So we'll start with Jerry in Baltimore, Disaster Government, National Emergencies, Continuity of Government, and Brian Tuohy. For Jerry. Go ahead, Jerry.
Yes, good morning. I grew up in the Vietnam era, and there was an incident that actually started the Vietnam conflict. It was called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution.
Of course.
Congress approved it. A North Vietnam boat hit a U.S. Navy boat or ship, and that's what started the Vietnam conflict rolling.
Well, it's kind of a false flag operation, and so we're talking about the USS Maddox.
Okay,
it's what that's called.
That's what I'm saying. Your guest completely overlooked the start of the Vietnam conflict. That's what triggered it.
I think you're mishearing him, but I'll let him explain it to you. But go ahead, just so Jerry understands, Brian.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I know about the Gulf of Tonkin and all that. Yeah, I mean, what I was arguing was that it wasn't a national emergency that created the Vietnam War as it did with the Korean War. It was a slightly different set of circumstances.
It was just a coincidence that it was right before the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, and that was also held in August of '64. And that would portray Johnson as a hawk.
Right. But it's not what we're talking about. It wasn't deemed a national emergency as a way of getting into that in the back door like they did with Korea. But appreciate you jumping in. Let's go to Jeff in Palm Springs for Brian Tuohy, Disaster Government. Jeff?
Hey, Ian and Brian, thank you for taking my call.
Glad to have you. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I think we have a national emergency going on right now with the lack of honesty and truth that comes out of our government. I mean, in the last 6 months, the president, no less than the president, has told a half a dozen blatant lies. I mean, just lies that are easy to prove wrong, and the newspapers call it 4 Pinocchios. Let's call a lie what it is, and as long as we're not getting any truth out of the government, they're out to do whatever the heck they want.
But when did this start? Wait. But when did this start for you? That this idea that a president would lie, when was this a new idea for you?
Well, when it affected me. But I grew up reading the paper and following what's going on, and took political science in college, and and try to keep myself informed. You know, the population nowadays, if it's not trending on something, nobody pays attention to it.
All
and I think our media is letting us down.
Here's the point. I think that the lying has been going on for a very long time. And I think that if you're just becoming aware of it because it's just affecting you now, consider yourself lucky. And I welcome you to the sunshine of understanding how much lying has been going on for as long as the lying has been going on. But that's why I refer you to the book Disaster Government. So, Brian, if you were going to give to somebody like Jeff an explanation of some of the other 4-star lies that presidents have gotten away with in the past under the guise of a national emergency, what would it be?
But just what a national emergency actually is. I mean, if you look at what's occurred in the United States recently with the economic collapse and, the bubbles bursting and the automakers needing to be bailed out and the bankers need to be bailed out and all these other things that have literally affected people here in the United States on an emergency level, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, those sorts of things, and none of those are considered national emergencies, yet all these other incidents are. That's, a curious point. And again, there's something that's called a national emergency. Why isn't that on CNN and MSN and all Fox News and all these other places? You would think something with that sort of title would be important.
Yeah, and what's the current longest running so-called national emergency on the top 24 right now? What did you say?
Related to export control.
Export control.
I think dates back to, I want to say, like the first Bush administration, even the Reagan administration.
That's what it was. Okay. So, but it gets renewed every year, and nobody on any channel gives it any critical assessment whatsoever. It's just another rubber stamp national emergency. Kevin is in St. Paul on Coast to Coast for Brian Tuohy. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, hey guys. If I could just start off, I agree that the lack of honesty in our government is just appalling, and I totally agree. It's both parties. It's how we got into Iraq. And the fact that we tolerate it as citizens is just shameful, to say the very least. But what I really wanted to talk about was your comments about FEMA. I think you're kind of missing the boat on that one. As far as national emergencies and FEMA's abilities or reach, they should only be viewed as being the head. They're not the body. I happen to belong to or volunteer with one of the major charities, and basically all the foot soldiers, and I should say all, but the vast majority of the foot soldiers in any emergency are going to be volunteers, or they're going to be local police, local fire rescue, not to mention a whole slew of mercenary organizations that are available to act as security and prison management and all sorts of things. So, the 6,000 people is just, that's the brains, that's the organizational effort, but that's not the foot on the ground.
Brian?
Well, that's a very excellent point. And before I answer that, I do have to just say a shout-out to Star Fox and Dark Penguin and a couple of the other people on ATS I've been chatting with during the commercials. I said I'd say hi, so I say hi. But I meant to actually bring this up earlier, is one of the problems I have is that the federal government for some reason, wants to be the first responders to any sort of disaster or terrorist attack. And Kevin's right. The first responder is going to be the local community. It's going to be local fire. It's going to be police. It's going to be rescue units. It might be the National Guard. It's going to be the people who are immediately affected and immediately in the area that are going to be the first to respond. But yet the federal government puts in billions of dollars into the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA and even into U.S. Northcom and the military to be the first responders, and they're never going to be the first responders. And that's one of the problems, I think, is if that funding instead went to the local communities that need it, that require it, disaster response would be a whole lot smoother and a lot more efficient.
Kevin, a thought?
Yeah, I would just say that's certainly true, and maybe the important thing to understand is that in any of those responses, it's not going to be, if it's any sizable sort of catastrophe, your local organizations, your local charitable groups, whatever mercenary organizations might be hired, they're not going to be in charge. The federal government is going to have the authority. The classes that a person like I might go to is really all about chain of command. It's all about how we respond to the orders that are brought down from the top, and the top is FEMA. So, to say that FEMA doesn't have the capability to impose themselves on society isn't correct, because they got the money, they have all the authority in any kind of major disaster, and when they say jump, people jump, and whether you're local, whether you're mercenary or whatever.
I don't know. I don't know that that's been fully tested to prove that that's true. But go ahead, Brian, and then we'll wrap it up.
I ask Kevin a question. Have you ever read the National Response Framework?
Yeah, I've been to FEMA classes, and I've responded to some weather-related disasters.
No. Have you ever read the document, the National Response Framework that FEMA...
Oh, no, I have not, no.
Okay, because I would ask you to go online, and anybody to go online and find this, because it's basically like a 40 or 50-page document that was put out that supposedly explains and delineates this control and command response that you talk about that FEMA is going to delegate. Because I had to literally read it. I'm a fairly intelligent guy. I had to literally read it 3, 4, or 5 times to make any sense out of it. And when I wrote about it in the book, I had to literally kind of almost rewrite it for it to make sense. Because all it talks about is making this command and control units and these op centers and these other, different delineation programs. And none of it talks about getting boots on the ground to help people or getting food and water to people. It's all about setting up these, chain of command things, and it's ridiculous because it makes no sense. Because the president's in charge.
I agree with you.
If he doesn't want to be. It all just kind of trickles down. It's bizarre.
Kevin, I'm going to get some other calls in here, but I appreciate what you're saying. I just happened, after reading Disaster Government, what you impressed me with, Brian, is the fact that under these executive orders, a president could pretty much do anything unless Congress or somebody else were to finally stand up to a president. Doesn't matter who it is, and they can almost kind of pound these square pegs into any of those agencies. But it's just, that's the part that was sort of stunning to me, is it doesn't have to follow a line like FEMA. And in a way, you could have FEMA like the good cop, and you could be doing bad cop out of a total other agency at the same time. And that's the kind of sleight of hand that happens over and over again under the guise of, quote, national emergency. Let's go to Kelsey Ann, who's in Denver on Coast to Coast. Kelsey Ann?
Hello. Yeah. I came across this term that really helped me understand the reaction of the average American citizen to learning this uncomfortable information. It's called cognitive dissonance, meaning you hold a belief inside, and this belief is contradictory to an experience or a piece of information that you've had. So, for example, if I have a belief that my government will protect me and is trustworthy, and if I have a belief that a corporation has my best interest, but if I'm watching 9/11 or Katrina, my internal belief will then will create a sense of discomfort, because what I'm seeing and watching does not coincide with what I believe. And with Katrina, there were people for days and days and days dying and starving, but for some reason, I personally have heard stories that they were able to have guys in black armor with guns standing on top of a Superdome, pointing their guns at these dying people. And so if FEMA and whoever else couldn't get in to help, how is it that these mercenary hired for corporate security guys were pointing guns at people who were dying in Katrina? And Deacon Ian, you are great, but I'm hoping that you might, because it seems like your responses, you don't really like what some of the things that you're hearing, but I would like to point out that the NSA is now building a huge, gigantic center in Utah to collect 100 years worth of cell phone, Wi-Fi, and computer and email information. Right now, it is illegal for them to process the information, but they're thinking maybe if they can collect it for 100 years on private citizens over cell phones, email, internet, collect all of it for 100 years, they have the capacity to collect 100 years worth of the stuff. Maybe at some point within 100 years, they will have the technology and also maybe some sort of legal loophole to see what you did 10 years ago, see what you looked up 5 years ago, see what you looked up 1 year ago. And then also for corporate media, Bradley Manning.
I know there's a question in here for Brian, right? I mean, so please, just so because there was somebody else was trying to get through, and I just want to make sure, because I'm sure you have one that you want to get to with him.
Yes. What I'm trying to point out here is that the government and corporations are already dismantling our constitutional rights and our freedoms as individual citizens. Bradley Manning tried to get all that information that was unsettling to him. He was in Iraq as an intelligence officer, and he was very upset at the horrificness of what he had to see and process as information. And when he tried to go to the New York Times, when he tried to go to all the newspapers, major newspapers in this country, they said, no, you do not want to share that information with America. And he is a person who is speaking out against our government's wrongs at this point, and he is in jail. Because
I know. His trial is coming up later on this year. Yeah, I mean, I think that we can all choose our heroes, and I'm open to people changing from good guys to bad guys depending on how their trials go. In that you were calling me out a little bit, I'll just be totally honest with you, Kelsey Ann. I don't believe everything I see on the internet. And there's lots of people who construct things and fake photographs and all that FEMA camp stuff, which turned out not to be true. And what's more interesting, and I hope that you'll get a chance to read the book, is that it may not fit into your narrative either. And that's what a lot of people bring is a narrative to these things, and they think that they've got it figured out, and then something comes along and challenges this, and it's not as easy. There's a lot more dotted lines, I think, in history than maybe, at least based on what your comments were, that you might be willing to accept. And I think that's where I stand with this, is that it's just not as simple as saying this is the way that it always is. And I think that's what I really like about what Brian is doing here is he's really calling everybody out onto the field. And that may not be comfortable for everybody, but I'm comfortable with calling them all out. So Brian, let's pick up with just there a little bit where Kelsey Ann was, somewhere in the middle of that. And in the time that we have before the bottom of the hour, do you have a response to that?
Well, I think you're right, is that it's, the whole book didn't necessarily fit my personal view either, because what I kind of went into as being like a conspiracy theory type of thing is not what it wound up being. And I did have to kind of change my thought, and I had to kind of change the way I thought about the government and what the government can do and what the president can do. The more I learned and the more I researched and the more I dug up this information. And, she brought up the thing at the beginning about cognitive dissonance, I think it's called, is that would really fit in with my first book, The Fix Is In, where people think, sports are legitimate. And then when you see the reality that maybe they're not as legitimate as you think and that they're being manipulated for TV and other purposes, well, it takes a while to wrap your head around that. And, once you kind of dig into these subject matters and do some research, and like you say, don't believe everything you see on the internet, but actually look to the sources from where they're getting this information, that, maybe you can change your mind and see things in a different light.
Yeah, and I'll be curious to follow the trial of Bradley Manning. There's many aspects of his story that have been getting some of which have been getting a lot of attention. WikiLeaks has been following the story a lot, so that's how I know it. But I also know there's a whole don't ask, don't tell aspect to his story, too, which makes it a compelling story. Tommy's in Delaware, and I think we have just enough time before the bottom of the hour if Tommy's quick. Go ahead, Tommy.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you for taking my call. There's two things. In Dover, Delaware, the police have put a curfew on the gas stations for Thursday through Sunday nights, and my sister and I both delivered newspapers, and she was pulled over the other night, and the officer told her that as of this summer, we will have to have permits because they're going to have a curfew.
For?
In my opinion, that's considered martial law.
Okay, but wait, a curfew for what? I'm curious. I'm trying a curfew for
no driving after a certain time at night. Period. Unless you have a legitimate reason.
In Dover, Delaware.
In Dover, Delaware.
And why would it be there and not other places?
From what she told me, they're touting it as because of the sequester, the lack of police officers or whatever. I do not know why.
Okay, well,
that's what the police officer told her.
You know what? I think that's an interesting idea, and I wonder whether more and more communities might do that, as if they don't have enough cops for a third shift, if they simply say, you can't be out after 11. It sounds insane, but, we're into for some very weird times, I believe, coming up as a result of this whole sequester deal. Disaster government, national emergencies, continuity of government, and you. And back to that, the you part, next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. We're going to line up another slate of calls. It's our last chance for you to get in with Brian Tuohy. Disaster government, national emergencies, continuity of government, and you. We're talking about abuses by the executive office, a pattern which really gets started with General Washington, President Washington, who recognized that there just were these gray areas that had yet to be resolved. So instead of waiting for other people to figure it out, he just thought, and in a method which was later perfected by Abraham Lincoln, might as well just do it until they, tell you no. And that's what executives have done ever since then, and using national emergencies as their guise. We'll get back to that and your questions and comments next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Well, let's pick it up with Karen in Amarillo for Brian Tuohy, disaster government. Go ahead, Karen.
Good morning, Ian. I have a question for you. Yes, if I'm not mistaken, didn't the continuity of government start with President Truman, and when it got to President Reagan, it was greatly expanded?
For the most part, that's correct, yeah. I mean, it really kind of kicked off, I think, more actually under Eisenhower during the Operation Alert era, which is kind of interesting because when they ran these Operation Alert exercises in the 1950s, it was the first time they actually relocated the president as part of an exercise out of Washington, D.C. to a supposedly secure site. And a secure site was literally like an army tent with a folding chair for Eisenhower. It wasn't anything, really elaborate or big. And during the first major exercise that the government conducted at that time, Eisenhower shocked everybody because 2 days into it, he deemed the whole plan and the whole thing way too complex, and he just said, I'm declaring martial law, the Army's going to take over, and he got up and left. That was the end of their plan. I mean, it was really a bizarre scenario, but that's how mismanaged it was at the time. And, by the time it got to Reagan, it had gotten way more organized and way more controlled and much, much larger.
Right. Well, also, to answer a previous caller, I was in New Orleans during Katrina. I was born and raised there. And I saw no mercenaries with firearms. There were no mercenaries on top of the Dome Stadium pointing guns down at people. There was a National Guard unit there. And people were desperate for water and food, but it was coming in. Where the disconnect comes in, and I used to be with emergency management. I was a director for a small town in Colorado. Where the disconnect comes in is when the federal government comes in and tries to override the emergency operation plans that are created by counties and towns that are already mapped out because they know what they need to do to respond to something. But then the federal government comes in, they have this big disconnect, and they say, no, you can't use that plan, you got to use ours, but they really don't have a plan. And also, during Katrina, all communications went down. Everything. The emergency management, sheriff's office, police departments, nobody had radios. All the modern equipment, which is what's called infrastructure-based, where they have to talk to towers and then the radio signals are relayed out. Everything went down except for one form of communication. Ian, can you guess what it is? Or what form?
No, go ahead.
Amateur radio, better known as ham radio.
Sure. Interesting.
Communications for everybody.
Yeah, that sure doesn't surprise me. And the patriotism that's usually displayed by amateur radio all over the country and the world, for that matter, probably save us all someday. Yeah, very good. Thank you. I appreciate that, Karen. Let me get to a couple of people who are hanging on. Is Verna in North Dakota on Coast to Coast for Brian Tuohy, disaster government. Verna?
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I, too, am dissatisfied with the government, but that's not why I called. I heard some negative reports about FEMA, and I just wanted to share with you my experience. In the summer of 2011, we had a terrible flood here in Minot. It was on the national news.
Sure.
And
it's huge.
I wasn't going to go to a shelter, but I had a pushy neighbor that, since I'm alone, he talked me into going. I mean, it was kind of a fast thing. And so while I was there for a week, and there was a lady from FEMA that came around and passed out information. And then a couple of days later, there was a fellow from FEMA, and I was standing talking with someone, and he came up to me and he asked me if I was Myrna, and I said yes, and he said, I need to see your house. And so I didn't have my house keys with me. They were in my car. So he said, I'll drive out and take a look. And so he was going to take some pictures. And I said, well, if they're good, I want to see them. If they're not, I don't want to see them. Well, he came out and walked around the house, could find no water anywhere. So then by that time I'd found the keys to the house, and I rode with him out here, and he went in every nook and cranny and could not find any water. I stayed at the shelter for a week, and during that week I had the contact with the 2 FEMA representatives. They eventually brought in FEMA trailers, I think from Louisiana, because there were over 400 homes that had to be demolished, and over 4,000 people were displaced. So it was a big thing, and it was on the national news. So I don't know who is in charge of FEMA or anything about it, but I do know that I had a positive experience with FEMA, and I just wanted to share that.
I think that's totally fair. Let me go to Michael, who's in Eugene on Coast to Coast for Brian Tuohy, Disaster Government. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring it up because it's somewhat related to where it's like the government with way back in 1937 with Henry Anslinger and William Randolph Hearst when they pushed the legalization of marijuana and especially industrial hemp through, and the millions of lives it has affected since then. And then during World War II, when they needed hemp for the war, there was a Hemp for Victory. The films that the government produced, to grow hemp for the war effort, and then suddenly, as soon as the war was over, it's like industrial hemp now is illegal to grow again. Not so much the marijuana thing, but we're the only country in the world where industrial hemp can't be grown. But it was a big scare, and the Attorney General pushed it through. They snuck it through in the middle of the night, but it's important because it's affected so many millions of lives.
Sure.
Since then,
No, wait, totally. I'm all for it. Do you have a thought on that, Brian?
No, I agree with you. I think it should be legalized. I mean, I think really going back to even my sports gambling argument, that I think a lot of things like sports gambling, I think a lot of the drugs should be legalized because prohibition doesn't work, and instead it just puts all the money into organized crime's hands, and it creates more of a problem as opposed to solving a problem.
Let's get to Leon in Napa as we're taking calls for Brian Tuohy, Disaster Government, National Emergencies, Continuity of Government, and you. Leon?
Hey, how you doing?
Good, go ahead.
My question for Brian primarily is there's been a lot of I don't like to put on the tin hat, the tinfoil hat, but I've been seeing some things that, I've been maybe have to get one sized. Primarily the thing about a bunch of government agencies buying a lot of ammunition, and the one that more concerned me were $1 million in targets called the No Hesitation line, which was like elderly individuals with shotguns, teenagers with handguns, a pregnant woman with a gun. It's just basically the typical gun owner. My question for you is, how likely do you think that, since Obama has made it very clear that he wants to go after quote-unquote assault weapons, that he could enact one of these executive orders and that no one would really rise up because they would just be like, oh, well, he's going after domestic terrorists, which means anyone that has a semi-automatic weapon.
Boy, I think the chances of nobody rising up is remarkably low. But Brian, where are you with that?
Well, it's funny. Out of all the documents I researched and dug up and read for writing the book, I never once saw any one of them talk about taking guns. Never once. Like the subject of gun and gun ownership never came up in anything I read, which I didn't really think about till I finished the book, actually, that how bizarre it was. Because, I mean, I saw, documents that said they could do all these other things, like I say, ration food, water, and energy, and all this other stuff. But yet never once did they mention guns. But he does bring up an interesting point, I think, too, is that, going back to World War II, the Army realized that a lot of soldiers didn't fire their weapons when they were at war. And as it progressed through the Korean War and the Vietnam War and today, the military was able to basically train that out of soldiers to make sure that they fired their weapons. And I think today it's pretty much, 100% that soldiers will fire when they require to. And I think it's kind of scary what he brings up is it's the same thing. Early on, the Army did a study about whether or not soldiers would fire upon American citizens. And it was very few of them said they would in a random survey. And I think they're starting really to train that out of American soldiers, to see Americans as potentially domestic terrorists and a threat to the government. And my hope is that if push ever came to shove and, some sort of revolution or something started, that the military wouldn't necessarily side with the federal government just because they are the federal government, but they would side on whoever falls on the constitutional side of things.
Right. There was that other piece, though, too, about the gold, right? About using an executive order to confiscate the gold.
Well, that was a national emergency in 1933 that FDR enacted that did. It confiscated gold, and it made gold ownership, I think, of above $100 illegal at the time.
And then there was another bite at the apple, too. Like, that wasn't even enough. So then they had to come up with another version to get even more gold. It was like...
Well, I was saying, FDR issued something which is a limited national emergency at the time, and then he issued an unlimited national emergency, which neither one of those are considered to be real things. But yet right. FDR just went ahead and did them anyway.
Right. Let's go to Mark in Florida on Coast to Coast for Brian Tuohy, Disaster Government. Mark?
Oh, thank you, Ian and Brian. Brian, it seems like you're asking, how is this happening, or why is it the way it is? And you would think that if government was made up of all Jews, that people would be upset, or all Catholics, or all blacks, or all whites, that people would be upset. But when it's made up of all lawyers and shysters, that people are kind of blind to it because they've been trained to believe that they need these lawyers to explain stuff to them. But then you get a Nancy Pelosi who can't read or write, and it's evidence because she says, when we get the bill, then we'll be able to read it and find out what's in it, because she has no idea what's going on. And then
I'm not sure he's saying any of the things about lawyers. I'm trying to follow you here, but I don't think I've heard Brian say that.
But he's asking, what's the cause of it?
Well, hold on. Let's. He's right here, so let's have him talk about it with you, because it's a lot easier than talking around him. Brian, do you want to talk about this here with Mark? He seems to think you're off base.
Well, I think I do ask the question of what is the cause of all this and why is it the way it is. I mean, unfortunately, I don't think I know enough about the government despite doing the research, or I don't think I'm not smart enough, but I just don't think we have all the cards. I think because so much of this, especially in relation to continuity of government and some of these other plans, are literally top secret. I mean, there's stuff I asked Freedom of Information Act requests I made for documents back in 2010 that I just literally have gotten answers to like last week. I mean, the government's not moving really fast on releasing some of this information, and some of it they will never release. So, I mean, it's hard to get to the bottom of this issue that I discuss in the book because they won't let you see the documents. And to a certain extent, that makes sense, because if it is a survival plan for the government, you have to kind of keep that secret so our enemies don't know what that is. But at the same time, when it's so top secret that members of Congress don't know what it is, perhaps we've gone a little too far.
Mark, does that help?
But it doesn't make sense that it's secret, because you got lawyers that like to keep things secret so they can make a living. We have a thing called an Amber Alert. When a child is missing, they notify the whole community to help find it. But when there's a terrorist, they don't tell us anything. That tells me there's not a terrorist. They just want to scare people. And the concept to preserve government, well, you want to preserve the people. So the continuity of government is basically a gang of lawyers saying, how can we trick the people into being slaves where we survive and they die, and we create the wars that they die in. So it's just a fraud placed upon the people to make them think that they're being protected by people that, Katrina's evidence, that a government that doesn't care about anybody but themselves, really. It's like me. I will take care of my family before I take care of my neighbors. And then if I have anything extra, well, I might help my neighbors, but I really mostly care about me.
Well, that's why, though, I don't think it's a trick, is because just what you said, the federal government, I think, believes that they need to be protected in order to help the rest of us. And that's why, like I say, it's not a trick. It's they, for whatever reason, really think they're that important over and above the rest of us, that if they're saved, if they're protected, then they can effectively respond and react to whatever situation is causing like a national emergency to help the rest of us survive. But the point is they will be saved immediately, and the rest of us, well, when they get to us, they get to us. So it's really up to us as citizens to protect ourselves. And I think really a lot of this, like I say, with disaster response and recovery, is it's a lot of you have to work within your own community and know your neighbors and be willing to help each other out.
Well, thank you, Mark. Let's get to Bob in Idaho on Coast to Coast for Brian Tuohy, Disaster Government, National Emergencies, Continuity of Government, and you. Oh, Bob's gone. Or then Patrick in Aberdeen, Washington. Patrick?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, I actually spent 13 years in the Army, and I have a good idea how things work, not perfectly, I could say, but everything I've been involved in has never, or I say rarely, are you there?
Yeah, right here.
Has rarely ever followed the plans they set. I've yet to try to remember one thing that I ever did in my deployments that ever followed any plans that were originally stated. So it's kind of hard. I don't expect any plan the government has to even be followed. I've never seen it. So, I mean, they have all these plans, but from what I've seen, they don't judge it until they get in that situation. And on a state level, they always call the National Guard in, irregardless. And every National Guard post or facility has the ability to contact the state. And so there is communication if there was something bad, but the National Guard, as I would say, is the upfront protection of everything. And those are local. Those aren't people imported, so...
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I've known a lot of people in the National Guard. I think they're all hardworking people that have tried to do the right thing, you know, whether it's here or whether they've been sent abroad. Yeah, I've never felt like they were jackbooted thugs that were going to be easily fooled by FEMA or something into turning on the American people. But there was a time, obviously, when that did happen in the 60s. And so maybe that's the important lesson we have to learn from history in order to avoid that happening again. Brian Tuohy, I hope you enjoyed your time.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, Ian.
Disaster Government, National Emergencies, Continuity of Government, and you. And link up with Brian Tuohy and grab this book. Is so much in here, well documented, good to read, even though it might shake your tree a little bit in terms of who you think are responsible for straying from the Constitution. So wide enough charge to go around to a lot of people. And thank you for your good research. I look forward to part 2 of your Fixes In book too someday, right? We just dropped? Okay, very good. Well, thank you, Brian. And listen, for everybody else out there, remember, at Deacon Punnett, DEACON PUNNETT. Love to keep in touch with you between now and our next visit. Mary Roach will be back with her new book of weird science on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Deus te amat, and I do too.